Apartheid was a system of racial segregation in South Africa that lasted for 43 years, between 1948 and 1991. It started in the early 1900s. It began with the Dutch, German, and French, as they had colonized South Africa and they had government power. White people aimed to have power over the economy. This urged them to separate the races. The Natives Land Act was established in 1913. It gave 93% of the land to white people and 7% to the non-whites. The Native National Congress, the NNC, later termed the African National Congress, ANC, was established by educated black people who aimed to fight for black rights. In 1944, Nelson Mandela joined the ANC in hopes to get black rights back. People were separated into 4 categories. Each racial category were said to live in different areas of the country. Interracial couples were banned by law, and already existing couples, married or not, were split. Anti-apartheid meant communist. Black people to show any form of resistance to apartheid were jailed. Black people over 16 had to carry identification passes. This allowed the government to trace the footsteps of black people, as they had to show their passes wherever they went. Each pass had the name and identification of each person. If black people were caught without their passes, they would be jailed and beaten. In 1953, the Bantu Education Act let the government separate education by race. Non-white schools only got a fraction of the fundings that white schools did. In non-white schools, there was one teacher for 60 students, and in white schools there was one teacher for 20. In 1955, a document called the Freedom Charter was written by the South African National Congress Alliance. It called for democracy, equal pay, equal land distribution, equal human rights, and more. On the 21st of March 1960, Pan-Africanist Congress, also known as PAC, marched the streets without their passes and encouraged civilians to join in the peaceful protest against mandatory passes. They had gathered a group of 5,000 people and 300 policemen had surrounded them. One of the protesters allegedly threw a stone at one of the policemen, and the policemen panicked and started to open fire, causing the death of 69 people and leaving over 180 injured. This came to be known as the Sharpeville Massacre. Resistance groups were banned by law, forcing them to go underground. It became clear that peaceful protesting was not going to be possible. In 1961, ANC and other resistance groups gave up peacefully protesting and started violently protest by cutting telephone lines and placing bombs in power plants and post offices. In 1961, Mandela became the leader of all of the resistance groups combined. In 1962, the Sabotage Act let the government imprison anyone caught doing an act of destruction. On the 5th of August 1962, Nelson Mandela, along with 7 other resistance fighters, are arrested and sentenced to life in prison for sabotage. This caused resistance to fade for many years. On the 16th of June 1976, groups of black students started protesting against unfair education conditions. This became known as the Soweto protest. Although students were protesting peacefully, police opened fire and killed many people. Official figures reported 23 people killed, but other reports and witnesses estimate at least 200 dead. Because of police efforts to cover up the number of people killed, it is still not clear how many people died that day. Images of the police firing on peacefully demonstrating students led an international revolt against South Africa, and its brutality was exposed. Countries around the world were no longer under the impression that apartheid was fair and was a good thing. Many resistance group leaders feared civil war and attempted to convince the Prime Minister to make peace, although they were rejected. The UN publicly stated that they did not support apartheid during the United Nations General Assembly in 1973. The protests and the government's violent retaliation, along with the national economic recession, drew attention from the international countries to South Africa. UN voted to press obligatory sale of arms embargoes on South Africa in 1976. In the 1980s, protests and riots became very common in South Africa. Peter Botha tried to make some reforms, including the elimination of the past laws and the ban of interracial sex and marriage. In 1989, Botha was forced to step down as F.W. de Klerk became the president. F.W. de Klerk made reforms in the registration that formed apartheid, ending the apartheid system. On the 11th of February 1990, Nelson Mandela was freed from prison after 27 years. Mandela and de Klerk worked together to create peace as protests and riots were still common in the country. On the 27th of April 1994, South Africa held their first free election. The ANC won with 2/3 of the vote, and Nelson Mandela became the first president of the new democratic government of South Africa. As apartheid ended not too long ago, South Africa still suffers from a lack of education and poverty. Something else that's also quite prominent is the racism that still exists in schools and workplaces. Although laws have been placed against them, mindsets have yet to change.